Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. As you're getting settled in, my name is Michelle Whittaker. I am the Communications Director at Rank the Vote. Really glad to have you with us this uh, evening or early afternoon for folks as we talk about what I know is going to be a really exciting topic for everybody. What are primaries? And as our fun title said, what's your type? So if you know what type of primary you have, if you could say hello in the chat and put the type of primary that you have. And if you don't know, that's okay. Just say, I don't know what kind of primaries we have in my state, because we are going to go through that and talk about it. So that's your opportunity to learn more. But want to just say welcome to everybody, and we're really glad to have some great folks from Unite America with us to help share their insights and knowledge and learn more about what's possible in the near future. So welcome, welcome. More folks are joining. It's really great to have all these people hopping on. And again, if you would, in the chat, feel free to introduce yourself, say, with your name and your location. And if you know what type of primary you have in your state, feel free to share it. If you don't, that's okay. You can just say, I don't know, because that's what we're going to talk about here. Couple of just other housekeeping items. We will have a Q&A time as part of this discussion. So if you have a question, feel free to put that either in the chat or we do have a spreadsheet. Are they? No, Celia, they're not going to, it's just in the chat, right? Sorry.
That's okay. You can use the spreadsheet too. I dropped the
Okay.
link. So for anyone
Okay.
who is happy to have two windows, go for it.
Okay, great. So you can put it into the spreadsheet or in the chat. And great to see folks already putting sharing where they are coming from and their type of primary if they know. Great. A couple of upcoming events that we have. So just wanted to remind folks that next week on August 17th, we'll have our National Grassroots Phone Bank. This happens twice a month, and it's a great opportunity to help with mobilizing efforts and reaching out to folks in different communities. And you get to do it with folks from around the country who join. So anyone in any state can join our grassroots phone bank. And, if we're on Zoom, you can meet people virtually who are part of that conversation and connect. So glad to have you here tonight, and we hope you can join us for that on the 17th. And then on the 19th, as a part of our series here on primaries, we will have Lisa Rice from Grow Democracy DC to talk about Washington DC's progress with their primaries in terms of their first use of RCV, as well as with the DC Council approving funding for semi-open primaries. They'll be preparing for that as well for their future elections. So lots to update on that. And that's happening on August 19th. So save that in your calendar and RSVP. It's a great follow-up to this call and learning about primaries. And then we also have regular trainings on our Ask Me Anything series. That is a great way to ask any questions that you may have about ranked choice voting, proportional representation, open primaries, fair maps, the issues that we work on here at Rank the Vote. And then we also have a pitch training. So we're really excited that with all those opportunities and hope you can join those as we go along. And want to just say once again, welcome, welcome to everybody who's here. And just take a moment to introduce our guests for the evening from Unite America. We have Beth and Walker. They're both great individuals who are working in the space. Beth is the policy director at Unite America, where she oversees original and commissioned research that diagnoses the problems with party primaries and evaluates the effectiveness of reform solutions. In addition to her research portfolio, Beth leads outreach efforts to educate stakeholders on elections and reform, like we're doing here. And she brings a nonpartisan perspective shaped by her experience at the National Council or National Conference of State Legislatures, the Oregon State Legislature, and in the United States Senate. So welcome, Beth. And as the partnerships director at Unite America, Walker oversees the national partner portfolio for the organization and their investments and directs development of shared infrastructure for all of the grantees. Walker brings a diverse set of experiences and commitment to civic innovation to his work. After he graduated from the University of Alabama, he began his career as a public school teacher. Thank you for that, doing that in Denver. And that instilled in him a deep belief in the power of community. So we're really glad to have both of them on. We're glad to have you all on, and I'm going to pass it over to them to do their presentation. And again, just remind you, if you have questions, feel free to put your questions in the chat or to use the spreadsheet, and we will go through them next. So passing it on to you, Beth and Walker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, Michelle. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm very excited for this discussion and appreciate you all hopping on. So today we're going to do a primary elections overview. And our plan for our brief presentation portion is to start with some policy definitions and the status of primaries across the US. I want to talk a little bit about the 2026 primary problem and some of the research we've done to diagnose what we're seeing in this year's midterm primary elections. Walker will then provide a bit more background on some of our 2026 state legislative efforts and also share with you a bit about what we expect in 2027. There will be plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end of our presentation, so I look forward to your questions. And with that, we will dive in. Okay, so the status of primaries. I like to say that there are 50 different types of primaries in this country. Each state truly has unique nuances in their policy, but for the sake of simplicity, I've separated them into three general categories. So the first is closed party primaries, which in 16 states, only registered voters with a political party have a right to vote in that party's primary. Independent voters are barred from participating unless the state parties establish a rule allowing them to participate. So independents do not generally have the right to participate in these states, and over 17 million independent voters are barred from participating in party primaries in this country. Next, when we talk about open party primaries, 31 states use some form of open party primary, and generally all registered, oops, sorry, I have a typo there, voters are eligible to participate in one party's primary election. Now, open party primaries can differ in two ways. Some states use a semi-open primary where independent voters can choose a major party's ballot. And then some states just have open primaries. Voters can choose which primary to participate regardless of how they're registered. And really the big difference in these states is that 14 out of 20 don't have a form of partisan voter registration. So they don't register voters by party and keep track of those details. But generally in an open party primary, you can select, regardless of your party status, which parties to vote in. Lastly, we have open all candidate primaries. And under open all candidate primaries, all candidates, regardless of party, appear on one ballot, and all registered voters can participate. So there's no select one major party ballot, everyone appears in the same place, and all voters, regardless of their partisan registration, can vote on that ballot. And then the top finishers, the main distinguishing being, do you advance two or do you advance four candidates, move on to that general election. And in the case of advancing four candidates from an open all candidate primary, ranked choice voting is used to help determine a majority winner. So that's the system used in Alaska. We have a really handy dandy 2-page explainer that maybe Celia can drop in the chat for you all that details the congressional and state primary type in your state. It also provides those definitions within it and lets you know which states use those various systems. So like I said, only 3 states have some form of open all-candidate primary. 16 are fully closed. Louisiana is a bit of a edge case this year. They used to have an open all-candidate primary and then a runoff election. It was really just a general election, and then if no one got majority support, they held a runoff. I'm sure many of you who have been following Louisiana this year, they went back to a semi-open party primary system, but then with the redistricting snafu, had to bring the House elections back to that open all-candidate primary system. So it's been a bit complicated there, but they have a unique system that's really not used anywhere in the US besides Louisiana. And then I'd also just like to mention that Nebraska uses a form of top 2 elections for their state legislative elections only. So that's also a unique edge case. But usually when we're talking about primary types, 47 states use some form of party primary compared to those 3 states that use an open all-candidate system. I wanted to share some of the research that we've collected this year so far on the primary problem. So again, this may look familiar to some of you. We have a continued decline in competition in our congressional elections in this country. That's obviously been exacerbated by the mid-decade redistricting that we've seen in several states. But really what that means is that the party primary matters more than it ever has before. And so far, this cycle, 39 states have held party primaries, but already 74.5% of Congress has been elected by around 8.5% of voters. And that's due to the nature of those safe seats. You know, Republican or Democratic seats are going to reliably elect Democrats or Republicans if they are safe. So the party primary really is the election that matters. But we know that on average, about 20% of voters turn out to participate in those elections. And the 20% that do are generally not reflective of the broader general electorate. So we diagnose this problem every cycle and leverage it as a way to talk about how the lack of competition, and leads to the lack of representation and really accountability in our politics. So we have a whole webpage going that tracks this week by week. We also just released a new report that looks at how many candidates ran in a safe seat without any competition and found that 150 candidates have effectively won without a single vote, given that the incumbent was running unopposed in a safe seat. So again, a pretty stark picture of the lack of competition in this country and really the lack of choice that voters have, even if they are showing up to participate in the primary election. Our institute has a number of different resources. We look at the primary problem from many different angles, but usually we're trying to diagnose participation, competition, representation, and polarization. And so I just highlighted some of the resources that we feature. There is another report here on the left that really looks at who participated in 2024, what are their demographic characteristics, because again, the people voting in these primary elections, especially in a safe seat, sort of have outsized impact on who gets elected to the district and who represents them in Congress. I also wanted to highlight that we have this data on a state legislative level. So every state legislative cycle, we look at just how few Americans participate in that state to elect their state legislature. And I can drop the link in the chat for this one as well, but it's sort of helpful way to look at what the level of competition in your state looks like, not only at the congressional level, but at the state legislative level. We also track how many state legislators run unopposed in their primaries. Lastly, this is hot off the press from our partners at the Bipartisan Policy Center. They have been tracking midterm turnout, and they'll eventually produce a report. They've done this since 2010, but they produce a report every year that tracks state level turnout. And it's just a really helpful resource, again, if you're looking for state level data, so to sort of characterize how many people are showing up to participate in these primary elections. So I'd recommend you check that out and leverage them as a resource. I am now going to pass it over to my colleague Walker to talk a little bit more about trends in 2026 and what we're monitoring for 2027.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. Hi, everybody. Welcome, Donaldson. Really great to see all of you, and Michelle and Celia. Thanks so much for hosting us. Beth, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I just want to talk briefly about the past year and really the past legislative session at the state legislature, just to give a glimpse into what we are seeing, what we are working on right now, and we is inclusive of many partners who are also doing this work at the state level to engage and support voters so that all voters can vote in all taxpayer-funded elections. And so, frankly, the picture is a tough one across much of the country and much of the southeastern US, especially right now. We are on the defensive. I think if you look back to the early 2020s, ranked choice voting and the RCV movement experienced kind of a similar moment where many states across the country began to restrict or ban RCV, often without even having RCV on the books or RCV elections. This kind of crazy premise of just doing something before it could even be tried out. What we're seeing in the Southeast, especially, is a version of that where states have open primaries often and are beginning to roll that back. And so you can see, looking at this map, there are only a couple of states and places where we are on the offensive right now on the legislative side. Pennsylvania, I think, is a very promising place. We can talk a little bit more about that. And then we've implemented in New Mexico and DC where semi-open primaries or open primaries are taking place now. So next slide, Beth. So just to give a glimpse into the offensive picture right now across the country, Pennsylvania is moving ever closer to passing an semi-open primaries bill, which will effectively allow 1.1 million independent voters to vote in the state. I believe that's the number. So it's significant. And then as Beth said, Louisiana, it's a complicated place. In 2024, the state decided to close their colloquially called jungle primary system, most likely as kind of a reprisal for Bill Cassidy's votes against Donald Trump. And then, in light of gerrymandering and redistricting, they've had to reopen them partially. And now there's this question of, will they go back to their former system? Will they keep the current one? We're working actively there. Delaware is a really exciting place, and I think speaks to the idea of what Rank the Vote and so many great people like you and organizations like this are about, which is this kind of grassroots momentum in a state where a legislator in the state said, wait, there are 100,000+ folks in Delaware who are independents who don't have the right to vote in the election of consequence. I should do something about that. And put a bill forward. A coalition of folks from research, from politics, from grassroots kind of came together to support him. The bill got it got out of the House committee with a kind of adversarial group of folks opposing it, and then it passed the House vote, and it didn't go out of the Senate before Sunday, so it's a live ball going into the next year, which is very exciting. And then finally, New Mexico passed semi-open primaries in 2025. It was implemented this year, and we had the second highest turnout ever for a primary election in New Mexico. Over 300,000 New Mexicans had the right to vote in the primary for the first time, and we saw increased turnout across the board. So really, really exciting there. Next slide, Beth. Now to go to the flip side, much longer list right now. What we see is that across the country, and specifically in Republican trifecta states across the Southeast, there's a real effort to close primaries, to roll back. This is a look back. So for the most part, with the exception of Ohio, all of the bills that were brought forward in 2026 were defeated. In South Carolina and Texas, which I'll slow down on, there are bills that have happened, and there are also lawsuits that are being filed by the GOP in the state. So there's kind of this two-pronged approach that we're thinking through and working on right now, contending with how to prevent primaries from being closed there. So next slide, please. A couple of just national trends. This is not one-off effort. This is a national coordinated effort. This is frankly a question of GOP loyalty enforcement. The Freedom Caucus has become more professionalized, and it's there's a lot of grassroots momentum, especially from the more extreme edges of the party right now, to make this a purity test. And the primary is a mechanism for doing that. That coupled with redrawing districts is kind of a double poison pill there. And then across the Southeast, what we see is that states are at high risk, some more than others, but there is a massive threat. And then what we've traditionally called governing Republicans. I don't have a better word for it, but kind of the more generally like forward focused Republicans working in state legislatures are often reluctant to disrupt the status quo, but they're also reluctant to keep their primaries open with the threat of being primaried themselves. And so you have this kind of catch 22 where they know the system works, it enfranchises more voters. And on the flip side, they see the threat from their right flank and they're incredibly cautious about the risk that that presents. And then case law is somewhat limited as it relates to primary elections, but where there is case law, it trends towards more party affiliation rights and rights of associations and away from voters having access. Next slide. Looking ahead to 2027, I think I had a bullet at some point that said something along the lines of 2027 will be our hardest year yet. That's a real thing. It's going to be the most challenging year from a threat perspective for states rolling back access to primary elections, locking out voters ahead of the 2028 election cycle. Just a quick look, I'll call out Alabama, my home state, Tennessee, Texas are all what we would call extremely high risk. The threat is real. Leadership in the state is very serious about getting this done. They have both pressure from members and there's increasing enthusiasm across the board to get this done. And they have strong majorities in the legislature and they control the governor's office. Texas has a lawsuit that is active. It's a complicated, long story. I recommend you read about it online because it's got some great drama to it. There's a new Secretary of State who is very likely to continue to defend the Texas system in contradiction to the Texas GOP, but there's a likely opportunity for the legislature to take up the issue in 2027 when they resume session. Next slide. And so 2027, looking ahead, there are a few assets that exist, and then I'll just talk quickly about the gaps that are there. Mostly the gaps exist on the right and engaging conservatives, engaging Republicans thoughtfully, doing it in a way that is both meets the moment and allows them to hear the perspective from fellow conservatives, from conservative voters who can say, hey, this is why I believe in the system of open primaries or our current system. And I think closing is a bad idea. Earned media is another place that just the more earned media there is, the better. And then the last one is constituent mobilization. And it's complicated. I think it's a case of taking the opportunity across many of these states to get folks fired up about this issue is really important. But at some level, it's also important as to who they are and legislators feeling like they're hearing from people who represent that or they represent and who are ideologically aligned, which is its own complicated thing to think about, but is a really important piece of the equation. Next slide. And that was it. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you, Beth and Walker. That was really some great information there. I was just kind of thinking about like the struggles and both with how for ranked choice voting and for open primaries, there's been, these defensive pieces that have really happened at the same time that there are these really moments and hopes I think, hopeful opportunities that we are seeing in states and more people kind of looking at it and questioning what's going on. So just want to remind folks, and we've got a bunch of questions ready to go. So we're going to jump into some of the questions that we have here that have been asked. And one of the questions that was sent in to us early was, is there an advantage to a top four or a top two primary? And how do you choose which one to shoot for or to like advocate for, I guess, if you will? I think that's where that question is coming from.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the policies I described today, I think you should think about as like lined up on a spectrum, right? From closed to top four open all candidate primaries, because while top two is better than I would say just the status quo of a party primary, in most cases it's still advancing a Republican and a Democrat, but at least, all voters have the opportunity to help participate in that primary and win on the field. But a top four system that is used in Alaska really helps to inject more competition into the general election specifically and give voters more choice. I think one of the main benefits of open all candidate primaries generally is that they can advance two candidates of the same party, which in a safe seat like we have in 90% of our districts gives voters a choice of a Democrat or a choice of a Republican and incentivizes candidates to really campaign on policy issues, not just against the other side. So that's the real benefit of, two versus four. But I think when asking yourself this question in the state, it's very important to think about what problem you're trying to solve, and also what progress might look like over a time series. A lot of this work hasn't happened overnight. The Pennsylvania fight legislatively has been 5 years plus in the making. And so I think it's really important to think about, what progress is possible in your state, where are voters, where are coalition groups, and what's possible, especially if your state has a ballot initiative, thinking about what the problem is and what the impact of these policies are is really important, and what's viable. I'm on the policy team, so I think about the policy and the research. There's a lot of different indicators that go into helping one understand what might be politically viable in a state. But I think, as Walker described, one of the biggest challenges in all of this is just having elite political support. It's really easy to be against any new system when the system that exists has elected you and sustained your position in office. And so I think that's a real challenge for all reformers to think about, how do we get elected leaders to embrace change and embrace reform as an opportunity to help them and allow them to be better representatives that can listen and respond to the interests of all of their constituents.
Well, thank you. And Beth, on that point of just like, how do we get legislators to kind of respond to that? One of the questions we had was just like, what are the persuasive arguments to legislators and party leadership? And as you're formulating your response to that, I just want to, as the communications director at Rank the Vote, just want to remind people that when we do have some peer-to-peer conversations that happen once a month, that could be an opportunity to talk through your best pitches to legislators on ranked choice voting, open primaries, any of the reforms we work on. But it's always important to tailor your message towards the people that you're talking to. And what can be persuasive is understanding their background, their needs, like understanding what's kind of motivating them or potentially could motivate them in one way or the other. So I'm sure, Beth, you can add on to that, right?
Yeah. I think, like I said, incumbents see reform as a threat to their reelection. I think it's really important to share research and evidence about where these systems are used. We're not seeing a massive turnover of elected leaders. That was especially the case in Alaska. The partisan composition of the Alaska legislature shifted at the very smallest margin, but it wasn't the case that it swept, an overwhelming number of Democrats or Republicans into office. The partisan breakdown in the legislature actually stayed remarkably similar to where it was the year prior. But what it did enable and continue to support is Alaska's cross-partisan governing coalition that had existed in the House, but prior to reform in Alaska, but it enabled that same cross-partisan coalition in the Senate chamber as well. And I think that's really important. It's again not that reform is trying to upend who wins and who loses, but that it's trying to really facilitate the incentive for legislators to work across the aisle, to not have to fear inviting a primary challenger from their ideological extreme for taking a specific vote, and to just help foster more collaborative and representative governance. So I would say, Michelle, it's exactly right to think about who you're talking to, but to also think about, what are they worried about, and what evidence do we have to sort of assuage them that worry is not a reality. It's
Yeah.
easier said than done.
Yeah, very much so. But we'll continue to work on that and hopefully share kind of the findings and insights we have as we continue to have those conversations across the country. A couple people have asked some questions related to turnout, and so I think one question is just like, how does changing the format or what kind of statistical effect does changing the turnout or changing the type of primary, excuse me, have on turnout? And similarly, do you see like there's a big drop off in voter participation when you have, a top two, top four primary or other types of primaries? We do know already that primary elections have a lower turnout than general elections. But is there something like, do specific types of primaries maybe have a different type of turnout?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally, turnout, I think, is driven mostly by electoral competition, especially if there is a race at the top of the ballot that's driving turnout. So I think Oregon, which has a closed primary state, is actually one of the states with the highest turnout this cycle. But generally, we see above average turnout in California, Washington, and Alaska. And it's hard to disentangle whether reform alone is driving that. But there is a peer reviewed journal article that suggests that states with open all candidate primaries help boost turnout, I think, by about 6 percentage points. So it increases turnout at the margins, but I would say what's really driving turnout is the presence of a competitive statewide elected office. I think that was especially the case in California this year with the governor's seat open. So I think knowing that competition drives turnout, I think the question is, how can we ensure that not only our primary elections, but our general elections are competitive? So I think that's what's most important. And I can find that study here to make sure people have that research on hand.
Great.
I would also just say that
Yeah.
in the case of open party primary states, generally we don't see massive differences when it comes to open party primary states being more competitive than closed party primary states. But what you do see is that turnout in those states is slightly more representative than turnout in closed party primary states. So opening primaries to all voters makes them more representative. But there's, I think, like I said, more work to be done on ensuring that those elections are competitive, because we shouldn't be so surprised that we don't get waves of new voters turning out to vote when they're still choosing between a party primary, right? And generally, I'm an independent voter in Colorado. Generally, I pick the ballot where I'm actually going to have some choice and some say in the outcome. And so there's more work to do, like I said, to really make voters feel like they have choice and a say. And I always say, even if you don't have competition at the congressional level, there's many other reasons to vote. So it's important to just get people to turn out in the first place, regardless of the fact that we've got a lot of work to do on the competitive part.
Yeah, definitely on that competitive piece, it's really key, and understanding the kind of different factors with that. Um, an interesting question about like the difference between partisan election and open primary. So someone was saying like my city has preliminary elections where all candidates are on the ballot. That's a nonpartisan election, but is basically how an open primary would be, question mark, or what different factors are involved when there are partisan candidates running. And I think this might again be a great question in terms of like a broader question and a reminder to folks that when we're working on reform, the different types of elections that are out there or what's on the ballot or what people are running for, there always needs to be good information and education to voters, because there can always be different changes or different types of election. And whether you're talking about a state election, a county level election, a municipal election, like all three of those can happen maybe even in the same year sometimes. And they may have different formats to how those elections run. So, Beth, what else would you share on that?
Yeah, really interesting question. And I think one thing that's important to think about is how candidates and their party affiliation might be displayed on a ballot. I think something like 80% of this country's elections are technically nonpartisan, especially at the local level, right? And sometimes partisan affiliation doesn't appear in those local elections. It's also the case in Nebraska's top two system for state legislature. They don't have party affiliation on the ballot. Um, I think it's an important cue to voters, especially in the case of Alaska. We have 17 candidates running for governor of Alaska. It's really helpful to know their partisan affiliation, and it's an important cue for voters to have that. I think Alaska could even go a step further to include party endorsement on the ballot so that voters would know, say you have three Republicans running in a race, which one is endorsed by the party. I think that would actually help perhaps electeds and parties embrace that type of system more because they're able to give a cue to voters that this is the party's preferred candidate. That could even think about that in a system like California's, where I know there was a lot of consternation around how many candidates were running for governor in California. So I think more information is always better. I would also say that local coalitions and local media play a huge role in this. I was really excited to see in Alaska that the local media organizations had partnered to field a candidate survey among those running for office. And then those organizations had planned to publish the results. And I think that is so great that, they combine forces. And really what they're doing is providing more information for voters to, inform their decision. Because like I said, it's hard to make a decision when 17 candidates are running for governor. And so there is a lot of opportunity. And I think it's really an important opportunity for local groups, for local media to come together and help provide voters with accessible information to inform their vote.
I think just to follow up on that, do you think if an election is nonpartisan, and this isn't specific to a primary election, but if an election is nonpartisan and you are showing party affiliation or like who's endorsed, does that take away from the partisan, like maintaining that nonpartisan atmosphere or type of election? I don't know if there's been any uh, study kind of that or like survey of how people view what a nonpartisan election is supposed to be in terms of its whole
Yeah.
makeup.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure about the research on that. And I'm not suggesting we should not have nonpartisan elections. I think they're quite important, especially in the context of those serving to oversee elections. I think it makes a ton of sense to have nonpartisan election officials. So I don't have a perspective on that or research to suggest that we should have partisan information on the ballot. But I do know that there has been studies on open all candidate systems and the importance of having uh, party registration associated with candidates to help voters make that decision.
Interesting. So that's a good note on like when you're looking at that type of primary system is that the ability to at least indicate partisan affiliation or potentially as you mentioned before, like that endorsement or other piece on it. Um, we've got lots of questions still, and again, want to remind folks if they have a question to feel free to put that either in the chat or in the spreadsheet. I think like so one question that is related to ranked choice voting, and I think this is a good opportunity to talk about like just the kind of overlap that sometimes happens. So two kind of pieces on this. One, uh, there are times, and Walker touched on this a little bit of like the defense that's happening on RCV and similar defense that is happening with open primaries. And I know even in Maryland, where I work on ranked choice voting, that we've experienced kind of this um, confusion where sometimes people are like, oh yeah, I'm working on RCV, and they're like, oh, is that about open primaries? And you're like, no, open primaries is does this, ranked choice voting does this, but if you get open primaries, we would suggest using RCV for it. It's like this kind of interesting conversation that happens there. So I wonder if you can touch on that a little bit and, what you think in terms of, uh, where you've seen places that have implemented open primaries with ranked choice voting. I think we have more open primaries without ranked choice voting, but what's the kind of difference between the two? Yeah.
Yeah, really, I think that open primaries are allowing all voters to participate in the election of consequence. Like that's the simplest way I can describe it to you. Ranked choice voting can be used in a primary and can be used in a general election. And in fact, many states across the US are using ranked choice voting in different ways at different election levels, at a local level, um, in a party primary as well. We've had ranked choice voting used in party conventions. And so I like to say that, open primary, letting all voters participate in the election of consequence, ranked choice voting, helping to elect a consensus winner. But I think what's important about this conversation is that there is not one perfect combination. I wouldn't suggest that all states should adopt the Alaska model. That's just not practical. And I think that's the beauty of our US elections is that we can look at individual states and think about different reform ideas. And so that's why I think there's been a conversation, especially in Washington, about utilizing ranked choice voting and a top two primary. That's an interesting combination. And I believe I'm trying to think of the other places that I've heard. We've heard about the top two RCV combination in California as well. Then we have, I'm so excited you all are going to hear from Lisa Wright soon to talk about DC's use of ranked choice voting in a semi-open primary. And so I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for this question, Michelle, but I think that it's important to think about there's many different policy permutations. And again, what problem are we trying to solve for? And what is actually what's viable in your state? So I hope that's helpful. Walker, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I think you covered it well. No, I think there's a question of viability, impact, kind of all of those things together. A different state may have a different type of voter set. Alaska is a fascinating place because of the just diversity of type of voter based on affiliation. A top four system makes a ton of sense there and I think works there. In other states, the top two system or some version like that, I think could make a lot of state where you're really talking about single party competition. So I think there are many ways to do this. And like as Beth said, many permutations of these policies working together or, kind of solving different problems at different levels.
Great. We have room for a few more questions. So jump to another one that we was asked here is that have legislators elected through an open primary talked about the benefits, and is there kind of a record or quotes for those folks who have been elected through an open primary and talked about like how that worked and why that was beneficial?
Yeah, There was just an op-ed in the Anchorage Daily News that was written by elected state legislators from 4 different parties. I will try to find it here as I'm talking, but they basically write about what the system has provided them from a collaboration and lawmaking perspective. And it's a really nice piece that just highlights what reform has helped enable. I think I just found it here. So I would say definitely keep your eyes peeled for op-eds and media. We don't have a good database of every elected that has come out to support and embrace reform. So usually what we're doing is sharing these opinion pieces that we get published in the media. It's really hard to get electeds to connect their ability to govern in X way to Y system. I think it's hard to get everyday Americans to see that as important. So while we don't have a huge database, also I would encourage you all to ask your own lawmaker what they think about these systems. It's important that we gather more information about them. But I would say the best evidence we have is out of Alaska, where I've seen even the media survey that I described actually asked candidates whether or not they'd be willing to join a cross-partisan coalition, and what they thought about the repeal effort that is unfortunately on the ballot again in Alaska. So the more that we ask electeds these questions, I think the more we get reform out there in the dialogue and conversation, especially when they're campaigning for office.
Yeah,
I would just add quickly
Mhm.
on that the Alaska candidate survey, for those of you who have an interest, is well worth reading, because I think it's a really great example of how media and politics can intersect in a pro-voter way, where you are informing the widest swath of voters about all of the issues, and the candidates have an opportunity to share their perspective. And it's just a kind of a beautiful example of multiple media outlets coming together. So worth digging into. Some very interesting answers in there too. On the defensive side, I'd say in a state like Alabama, for example, voters, and I mean, I think Beth and I are in a very small minority here, where we wake up every day and this is what we think about. Voters don't necessarily think about the type of system that they exist in. And so when states are looking to roll back their system, I think you see the minority party starts to say, wait a minute, like, we don't want to do this. In Alabama, we heard testimony from Democrats saying, well, if the Republicans want to close the primary, they can, but we're not going to do that because we believe we want a big coalition. But even now in Alabama, as things are really heating up there in advance of session, you're starting to see some legislators come out in parts of the state and say, I'm a Republican, I'm a Trump Republican. I was elected by a coalition of Republicans and independents who voted for me. I don't want to close the system. I don't want to regress, because I know that I have people who don't affiliate with a party who vote for me every election, and they're an important part of my voting base. Those are still few and far between. Like Beth said, I think it's just not something people are waking up thinking every day about until it could be taken away. Um, and two, legislators are rightfully very guarded about this, because it is a complicated issue for them.
Thank you, Walker, for adding that detail. I wonder, Walker, if a if a legislator, or like if one party wanted to close their primary, could one party close their primary while another party kept it open? That is possible, right? But most of the
Uh,
time they write legislation to just blanket close it or open it. Is that correct?
yeah, Beth can tap in here too. It's complicated. I think what we've heard in a lot of southern states is we wouldn't just close this for one party. Like, that's not that disadvantages us. Like, if we're going to close it, it's going to close all the way. Whether or not that's immediate is another story, but that is the
Yeah.
general thought.
Yeah, some states with closed primaries actually leave it open to parties to determine whether or not they'll allow independents to vote. We still qualify that as a closed primary because the voters' right is at the whim of what the party decides. But I think what Walker's describing also opens up the conversation even further to talk about, okay, if Alabama did close its primary, what's the best possible version of a closed primary? And so we're thinking about some of the policy nuances around, having a later registration deadline, and not only a later registration deadline, but a later partisan affiliation deadline. So that, if a state does close their primary, at least, a voter could change their party voter registration later than maybe what is required now. Some states require like 6 months in advance for you to do that. And so, what is the least harmful version of this policy is something we're really thinking about right now, because unfortunately the threat is quite real. And I think this threat is especially pernicious when combined with some of the redistricting that we're seeing, because it's really locking out most voters from the election of consequence and from the party who's in power. And so yeah, it's a tough time, but I think that there's nuanced policy wins, even if we do see the closure of primaries, that again would make these policies a bit more flexible for voters.
Michelle,
Yeah.
there was a great question in the spreadsheet that I was just curious if we could. I'm sorry to hijack
Yeah,
your
no,
great
we can go to that,
question.
definitely. Yep.
There was a question: is this issue something we as individuals can do anything about, or is it more of a lobbying judicial around the push to close primaries? I just think that's for an
Yes,
organization
I
like.
was going to that one next.
Oh,
So yeah,
cool. Okay.
go.
I was just gonna say, as someone who deeply admires the work that Michelle, Celia, Eileen, and the Rank the Vote team do, I think this is a really important question. Frankly, a lot of the legislative work isn't like it's an inside ball game. It's the legislator relationships. It's those kinds of things. And yet, especially in states that are looking to close or not really having any momentum, I think there's immense power in voters speaking directly to their legislators about the impact of the system and what it means for them and the consequences that it will have for them, for their friends, for their family. Like we have heard time and again that really matters. And we were last week we were in Philadelphia for the week, and we met with the AFL-CIO there, and they talked about their membership, many of whom are independent voters, and these are people who have voted for Trump or Obama or Biden or Green Party. They've taken all kinds of votes, and they feel like in the election of consequence they have no say, and in the primary they can't do anything, and they want to have a voice, and that really matters, and that has really pushed like that kind of action in a state from people who feel deeply passionate about this, who want to have a say in the election of consequence, really has moved the needle, if not for like a direct legislator, for civic organizations, for social groups that like can also represent a broader constituency. So I think there is a lot of power in that, in addition to like, yeah, it matters to, talk to the right legislators and those kinds of things.
Yeah. And I think related to the question on like what folks can do is what our organizations are endorsing or supporting open primaries or defending against these rollbacks. I'll just say, again, if you're not familiar, like ranked choice voting has open primaries as one of our pillars of reforms that we work on, along with ranked choice voting, proportional representation, and advancing fair maps. Unite America has been at the forefront of working on this, and several other organizations. So please talk about some of the groups that are working on this in different ways.
Sure, happy to hit on that quickly. The election reform space is a small but mighty space of organizations who are really committed to this, and yet I think the coalition is growing across the board, which is very exciting. Groups like Open Primaries, Veterans for All Voters, the Independent Center are other really big organizations that do grassroots work specifically around primary reform, defending systems, things like that. You have groups on the research side who do a lot of work to build the evidence base for reform, build the case for why it is important. Those are kind of the big ones. There's a lot of smaller organizations that see the immense importance of this on like a state by state level. Um, but at the national level, those are really the big ones. Individual like League of Women Voters leagues in specific states have been, New Mexico, for example, Ohio, have been incredibly important in those states in advancing open primaries or defending them as well.
Great. And I know we're coming to the close of our time. And Deborah, yeah, we will, just to let folks know, 'cause there is this meeting has been recorded, so we will have a recording available for folks later. And we can also, we'll be sending out follow-up information from this meeting. And one of those things, Deborah, we can do is make sure that we kind of have that main list of some of the folks that Walker mentioned here, and links to other resources and material that has been shared by Beth and Walker. I wanted to say, like, this has been a really great conversation and really fascinating. I know that there were many more questions, and if Beth and Walker, if you want to take some time to write responses, and I'm happy to make sure. I know Celia, we can put them in the email to send out after the meeting to just help follow up with those. But great questions from everybody. And really, again, just a reminder that this, like, as Walker said, the reform movement space is small in some instances, but we are mighty because the interest in improving our elections to give voters greater choice, to give voters a stronger voice is really clear, whether you're talking about primaries or you're talking about ranked choice voting. And so we have a great opportunity to make sure that we're helping to educate folks that we're working with in our states about what's possible and how these reforms can work together and do work individually to help create a better democracy for everyone. Celia is dropping in a survey. We would love to get your feedback and any suggestions for future meetings that we can have. And as I mentioned at the top, we have some upcoming trainings. On August 17th, we'll have our National Grassroots Phone Bank. August 18th will be our second part of our primary series with Lisa Rice from Grow Democracy DC to talk about where DC, the district is, how their first RCV election went, and their move towards semi-open primaries. So lots of great opportunities to be a part of our upcoming trainings, along with our Ask Me Anythings and our pitch trainings so that you can get more familiar and help make the case to your local legislators or share it with your community groups or others as you're moving forward. And again, just want to say that I'm so grateful for everyone that was able to join, and really grateful for United American, for Beth and Walker for joining us to share their insights and information. I know, like, there's a ton of questions in my head that I'm thinking about, and I'm thinking about, like, what is possible in my state and what conversations are a great opportunity just to have with folks on what our primary systems are, whether we're talking about state level or we're talking about local municipal elections, whether they're nonpartisan elections or they do have a partisan primary. It's a great opportunity to talk about what type of elections, and as Beth said, what problem are we trying to solve and how do we have the right tools to make that happen. So thanks again for joining us. Celia will be sending out a follow-up email with the resources, links, and answers to other questions. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our future training events, and hope you have a great evening. So thanks again, everybody.